The Yorkshire moors were not the type of place you wanted to get lost in, but that's exactly what happened to me in the summer of 2016. I had been hiking and camping for years, mostly in the Peak District and the Lake District, but I wanted to try something different. The moors had always fascinated me. Vast, empty, and unforgiving. There was something unsettling about their emptiness, and I wanted to experience that isolation firsthand. I had planned a 4-day solo camping trip through a remote stretch of the moors, following an old trail that wasn't on any modern maps. I had found it in a book about forgotten hiking routes and thought it would be a good challenge. The book warned about rough terrain and unpredictable weather, but I was confident. I had a sturdy rucksack, a reliable tent, and enough supplies to last a week if needed. I set off early on a Wednesday morning, parking my car in a small village and heading straight into the wilderness. The first day was uneventful. I hiked for hours, surrounded by endless rolling hills covered in thick, windswept grass. The sky was a dull gray, the air cool but not unpleasant. I found a decent spot near a small stream and set up camp. That night, the silence felt heavier than I expected. The moors were different from forests. There was no rustling of leaves, no distant howls of animals, just an oppressive stillness. I barely slept. Every time the wind shifted, I thought I heard something moving in the distance. I told myself it was just the moors playing tricks on me. On the second day, I pushed further into the hills, following the old trail as best as I could. It was overgrown and barely visible, but I managed to stay on course. By midday, the terrain became more difficult. The hills turned steeper, and the ground was uneven, covered in loose rocks and thick patches of heather. I was exhausted by the time I found a place to set up my tent. That night, I heard footsteps. Not animal footsteps, human. Slow, deliberate. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then I heard them again. They weren't close, but they were there, moving somewhere beyond my tent. I sat up, heart pounding, listening for any other sounds. The moors were supposed to be empty. I hadn't seen another person all day. I grabbed my torch and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The darkness was overwhelming. The moors stretched out endlessly in all directions, but I saw nothing. No movement, no figures, nothing. I listened for another minute, but the footsteps were gone. I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I tried to sleep, but every small sound kept me on edge. By the third day, I was feeling uneasy. I was far from the village now, in a part of the moors that felt untouched. The landscape was harsher, with deep gullies and sudden drops that made hiking dangerous. My nerves were starting to get the better of me, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling as if I wasn't alone. That evening, I made camp in a small dip between two hills, hoping it would offer some shelter from the wind. I set up my tent, cooked a small meal, and tried to shake off the sense of unease. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, I noticed something strange. There was a shape on the far hill. At first, I thought it was just a rock, but as the light faded, I realized it was standing. A figure, too far to make out any details, but definitely human. My stomach twisted. It wasn't moving, just standing there watching. I forced myself to look away, telling myself it was nothing. Maybe a lone hiker, maybe just my imagination. But when I looked back, it was gone. That night, I barely slept. The footsteps returned, closer this time. Slow, cautious, circling my tent. My breath was shallow, my heart hammering. I didn't dare move. I lay there, gripping my knife, waiting for something to happen. Hours passed. The footsteps came and went, but nothing else happened. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted into a restless sleep. By the fourth day, I was done. I had planned to stay another night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I packed up early and started the long hike back, but the moors had other plans. An hour into my hike, I realized the trail had disappeared. The landscape looked unfamiliar, even though I had been careful to follow my map. I should have been heading west, back towards the village, but somehow I was deeper into the hills. My compass still pointed in the right direction, but nothing matched what I expected. The hills seemed taller, the valleys steeper. I kept walking, hoping I'd find a familiar landmark. But as the hours dragged on, I started to panic. The moors all looked the same, endless stretches of grass and rock with no real markers. The sky was growing darker, and I knew I couldn't afford to be caught out here for another night. Then I saw it, a structure in the distance, small, made of stone, barely visible against the landscape. My heart leapt. A shepherd's hut, maybe an old bothy. Shelter. I hurried towards it, the wind picking up around me. As I got closer, I realized it was more ruin than hut. The walls were crumbling, the roof half collapsed. But it was something. I stepped inside, grateful for the break from the wind. The inside was dark, damp, but empty. No signs of recent use. Just an old wooden bench and a pile of stones where a fire pit used to be. I dropped my pack, breathing heavily, and then I saw the footprints, fresh, leading from the doorway to the back of the hut. Not mine. I froze. Someone had been here, recently, maybe still was. The wind howled outside, rattling the broken walls. I gripped my knife, stepping backwards towards the entrance. I needed to leave, out, and then I heard it. A breath, not mine, close. I didn't look. I didn't hesitate. I ran. I didn't stop, didn't think, just moved. My legs burned, my lungs ached, but I kept going. The landscape blurred around me, the sky darkening with every step. I don't know how long I ran before I saw the lights, distant, flickering. The village, my car. I stumbled the last stretch, barely able to breathe. I didn't look back. I threw my pack into the car, started the engine, and didn't stop until I was miles away. I never went back. To this day, I don't know who or what I encountered out there. Maybe it was just another hiker, maybe something worse. But I do know one thing. The moors are not as empty as they seem, and some places are best left alone. I don't know why I did it. I don't know why I agreed. Maybe it was boredom. Maybe it was something deeper, something I wasn't willing to admit to myself. The kind of thing that makes you want to test your limits, see how far you can push yourself before you crack. Started with a stupid thought. What would it be like to spend a night in a graveyard? Not in a car parked nearby, not in a tent set up at the edge of some forgotten cemetery, but right in the middle of it. A real night out there, alone. I wasn't superstitious. I didn't believe in ghosts, spirits, or any of that nonsense. But I did believe in people. People were unpredictable, dangerous. And cemeteries, well, they weren't exactly high-traffic areas. They attracted the kind of people you didn't want to run into when you were alone in the dark. That should have been enough to stop me. It wasn't. I picked a place far from the city. Some old burial ground way out past a small town, the kind of place no one visited anymore. The land was uneven, covered in wild grass, and the headstones were cracked, some half-buried from years of neglect. It was the perfect spot. I packed light, just a sleeping bag, a flashlight, some food, and my knife. The knife was more for my peace of mind than anything else. I wasn't expecting trouble, but I wasn't stupid either. I got there late in the afternoon. The sun was still up, casting long shadows through the rows of tombstones. The place was dead quiet, no pun intended. No cars, no houses nearby, just an overgrown lot with rusting metal gates barely hanging onto their hinges. I walked in, my boots crunching against the gravel path, and took a slow look around. The graves stretched out in uneven rows, some tilting, some sunken into the earth. A few had iron fences around them, but most were just slabs of stone sticking out of the ground like rotten teeth. The air felt different here, heavy, stagnant. I found a spot near the center, where the grass was flat enough to roll out my sleeping bag. The sky was turning orange by then, the sun dipping behind the trees. I set up quickly, not wanting to fumble around in the dark. By the time I was done, the light was almost gone. The wind had picked up, rattling the branches overhead. I sat down on my sleeping bag, chewing on a protein bar, listening. Silence. I should have been able to hear something. Crickets, the rustling of small animals in the grass, the distant sound of cars on a highway, but there was nothing, just the wind and the sound of my own breathing. I told myself it was fine, normal, just my brain playing tricks on me. I checked my watch. 9:30 p.m. It was going to be a long night. First, it wasn't bad. A little eerie, sure, but nothing I couldn't handle. The air got colder, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me, lying back on my sleeping bag. The flashlight was next to me, the knife tucked inside my coat. I stared up at the sky. The stars were clear, brighter than they ever looked in the city. I focused on them, letting my mind drift, trying not to think about where I was. Then I heard it, something moving, not the wind, not some small animal, something bigger. I sat up slowly, my breath tight in my chest. The sound was faint, coming from the other side of the graveyard. A soft, deliberate crunch of footsteps on grass. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, sweeping the beam across the tombstones. The light cut through the dark, but there was nothing there, just rows of graves stretching into the distance. I told myself it was my imagination, maybe an old tree creaking, maybe a deer, but I kept the flashlight in my hand. I waited, listened, nothing. I lay back down, but sleep wasn't coming. Every sound, every whisper of wind through the trees, felt amplified. The silence, when it came, was worse. Then the sound came again, closer. This time I knew I wasn't imagining it. I sat up fast, heart pounding. The flashlight trembled in my grip as I scanned the graveyard. Still nothing. I turned it off, holding my breath, straining my ears. Then I heard it, breathing, soft, slow, too close. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up. The sound was just beyond my vision, behind one of the headstones. I gripped the knife inside my jacket, forcing myself to move. I clicked the flashlight back on and pointed it toward the sound. Nothing. The breath was gone. I stood up, every hair on my body standing on end. I wasn't alone. I knew that now. I didn't call out. That would have been stupid. Whoever was out here already knew I was here. I scanned the graves, my heart slamming against my ribs. I could feel the cold sweat on my back, my pulse hammering in my ears. Then I saw it, a shape, low to the ground, half hidden behind a tombstone. I barely had time to react before it moved. Fast, too fast. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. The figure darted between the graves, low and silent, moving like it knew the land better than I did. I ran. I didn't think, didn't stop to grab my stuff. I just ran, my boots slipping on the uneven ground, the light bouncing wildly in my grip. I reached the gate, shoving it open so hard the rusted metal screeched. I didn't look back. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs felt like they were going to give out. I didn't stop until I saw the lights of my car parked on the side of the dirt road. I fumbled for my keys, hands shaking so bad I could barely get them in the lock. I threw myself inside, slamming the door, locking it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, waiting for something, anything, to come out of the darkness. But nothing did. I didn't sleep that night. I drove straight home, hands clenched around the wheel the entire way. I told myself I was done with stupid ideas, that I wasn't going to do something like that again. But the worst part wasn't what happened that night. The worst part was what I found the next day. When I finally worked up the nerve to go back, just to grab my stuff, nothing else. I found my sleeping bag right where I left it, but my flashlight was gone, and so was my knife. And there, in the dirt, were footprints. Not mine, someone else's, leading away from where I'd been sleeping, straight into the trees. I never went back. I never told anyone, but I think about it sometimes. Late at night, when the wind gets too still and the silence gets too deep. And I wonder, who else was out there with me? And what would have happened if I hadn't run? I don't think I want to know, and I sure as hell don't want to find out. I had always liked being alone in nature. It was something about the quiet, the stillness, the feeling of being so far away from everything that no one could bother you. It gave me peace. So, when I had a few days off work, I decided to take a solo camping trip deep into the woods. I wanted to be far away from the sounds of cars and people, somewhere remote where I wouldn't run into another soul. I had found a spot on the map, a thick forest far from any main road. The nearest town was miles away, just a small place with one gas station and a few houses. I packed up my truck with my camping gear, a cooler full of food, and enough supplies to last me for several days. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going, just that I'd be out camping for a while. The drive was long, and the roads became rougher the further I went. Eventually, I left the pavement behind, driving onto a dirt road that cut through the trees. The deeper I went, the narrower the road became, until it was barely more than a trail. I had to drive slowly to avoid potholes and fallen branches. After nearly an hour of this, I finally reached the spot I had marked on my map. The place was perfect. Thick trees all around, no sign of people, and a small clearing just big enough for my tent. A creek ran nearby, and I could hear the water trickling over rocks. It was exactly what I wanted, complete solitude. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and cooked myself a simple meal as the sun started to set. The air was crisp, and the forest was alive with the sounds of crickets and the occasional rustling of leaves as some small animal moved through the undergrowth. I sat by the fire, watching the flames dance, feeling that deep sense of calm that I had been craving. But that night, something felt off. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. I was out in the woods alone. Of course, my mind would play tricks on me. But as I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up at the tent ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't a sound or a movement that set me off. It was the silence. The forest had gone quiet. No crickets, no rustling, just complete, unnatural stillness. I held my breath, listening, straining to hear anything. A breeze should have been moving through the trees, but I couldn't hear it. It was as if the whole forest was holding its breath. Then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the sounds returned. The crickets started chirping again, the wind moved through the branches, and everything felt normal. I told myself it was nothing, just a strange moment of stillness, and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I woke up early and decided to explore. I wanted to hike deeper into the woods, see if I could find a better spot or maybe just enjoy the walk. I packed a small bag with water and snacks, grabbed my knife, just in case, and set off. The forest was dense, but I followed the creek, figuring it would lead me back to camp easily. I walked for hours, taking in the sights, breathing in the fresh air. But as I moved deeper into the trees, I started noticing things that felt out of place. A tree with deep claw marks gouged into the bark. A pile of bones, not animal bones, but something larger, arranged in a way that didn't look natural. A small clearing where the ground looked disturbed, like something had been buried there recently. I told myself I was just overthinking things. Maybe a bear had marked that tree. Maybe some hunter had left those bones behind. Maybe the disturbed earth was from an animal digging. But deep down, I felt something was wrong. I turned around and started heading back to camp. I walked fast, keeping my knife in my hand. The forest felt different now, less inviting, more watching. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was beginning to set. I threw more wood on the fire, trying to push back the unease I felt. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold. Footprints, not mine. They circled my camp, moving through the dirt near my tent, passing by where I had been sitting the night before. And they weren't fresh. They had been there for hours, maybe even from the night before. Someone had been watching me. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the trees, but there was nothing but darkness. I listened, but I couldn't hear anything unusual. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for something, anything to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, I forced myself to sit back down by the fire. I kept my knife close, my ears alert. I told myself I would stay one more night, but I would keep watch. The hours dragged on. The fire burned low. I sat there, barely blinking, listening for anything out of place. Then, sometime after midnight, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Not the sound of an animal, but of something or someone moving through the trees. I gripped my knife, holding my breath. The footsteps stopped just outside the firelight. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. Whoever it was, they were watching me. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just sat there, gripping my knife, waiting. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps retreated. The sounds faded into the darkness, disappearing into the trees. I didn't sleep that night. As soon as the sun started to rise, I packed up my gear as fast as I could. I didn't eat. I didn't stop to rest. I just shoved everything into my truck and got the hell out of there. The drive back felt like it took forever. I kept checking my mirrors, expecting to see someone following me, but there was nothing. When I finally reached the main road, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back in town, surrounded by people. I never went back to that forest. I never told anyone what happened. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying in bed, I think about those footprints, about the silence in the woods, about the feeling of being watched. And I wonder, what would have happened if I had stayed one more night? It was the summer of 2014 when my auntie asked me to go camping with her for a few days. She had always been the adventurous type, the kind of person who didn't mind sleeping in a tent in the middle of nowhere. I wasn't as eager as she was, but I didn't have much going on that summer, so I agreed. We drove out to a remote area in northern Canada, far from any town or city. My auntie had heard about this spot from a friend. It was deep in the forest, near a lake, and barely anyone knew about it. There was no cell service, no marked trails, just nature and silence. She loved that kind of thing. I wasn't sure how I felt about it yet. The drive took hours, and as we got further from civilization, the roads became rougher. The trees lined both sides of the road so thickly that the sunlight barely reached through. I remember staring out the window, watching the towering pines blur past, feeling a strange mix of excitement and unease. When we finally reached the campsite, it was nearly evening. The air was still, and the only sound was the occasional rustling of leaves. We found a small clearing near the lake and set up our tent. It was a basic two-person tent, nothing fancy. My auntie handled most of the setup since she was more experienced, while I gathered wood for the fire. As the sun dipped behind the trees, the temperature dropped. The fire crackled between us, casting flickering shadows on the surrounding trees. The lake was calm, reflecting the darkening sky. It should have been peaceful, but something felt off. The forest was too quiet. Usually you'd hear birds or insects, but there was nothing, just silence. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that I was just being paranoid. We ate dinner, sat by the fire for a while, and then decided to get some sleep. My auntie was out within minutes, but I struggled to fall asleep. The silence outside felt heavy, pressing down on me. At some point in the night, I must have dozed off because I woke up to the sound of twigs snapping outside the tent. My eyes snapped open, heart pounding. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal scurrying through the underbrush. It was the sound of footsteps. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. They circled the tent. I wanted to wake my auntie, but I was frozen in place, terrified that whoever, or whatever, was out there would hear me move. Then the footsteps stopped. I waited, staring at the thin fabric of the tent, trying to see if there was a shadow or a shape outside. Nothing. The silence stretched on, and eventually, I convinced myself that it had been an animal after all. Maybe a deer, maybe a raccoon. I forced myself to close my eyes and eventually drifted off. The next morning, my auntie was up before me, boiling water over the fire. I hesitated before telling her what I had heard. I expected her to dismiss it, but instead, she frowned. "We should check around," she said. We walked around the campsite, looking for any signs of disturbance. That's when we saw them. Footprints. Human footprints. They weren't ours. They were larger, heavier. They circled our tent several times before disappearing into the woods. My stomach twisted. Someone had been out there last night watching us. "We're leaving," my auntie said. We packed up as fast as we could. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone watching us from the trees. But there was nothing. The drive back felt longer than before, the forest closing in around us. Neither of us spoke much. We didn't need to. We both knew what had happened. Someone had been out there. Someone had been watching us. We never went back to that spot again. I was camping alone in France in the summer of 2016. It wasn't my first time camping by myself, and it wasn't my first time in France either. I had done solo trips before, mostly in the UK, but I wanted something different this time. I had taken time off work and planned to spend a week hiking through parts of rural France, sleeping in the woods, away from people, away from cities, just disconnected from everything. I had picked a spot deep in a forest in the Auvergne region. It wasn't a touristy place, which was exactly what I wanted. The forest stretched for miles, dense with towering pines and narrow trails. It was the kind of place where you wouldn't just stumble across other people. You had to want to be there. I had arrived late in the afternoon, parked my rental car near the edge of a dirt road, and hiked about 4 miles in. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. The sound of the wind through the trees, the occasional bird call, those were the only noises. I found a clearing near a slow-moving stream and set up camp. A small tent, a campfire, my backpack with food and a knife. That was all I needed. The first night was peaceful. I cooked some canned food over the fire, listened to the sounds of the forest, and eventually drifted off to sleep. The next day, I spent hours hiking around, exploring, and enjoying the solitude. I followed an old, overgrown path that barely looked like a trail anymore, pushing through thick brush and climbing over fallen logs. By late afternoon, I started heading back toward my campsite, taking a slightly different route. That's when I first noticed it. Something felt off. I couldn't explain why, but I suddenly felt like I wasn't alone. There was no sound, no movement, nothing obvious. But something in the air had changed. The forest felt different, heavier. I kept walking, moving a little faster than before. Then I saw it. A footprint. It was fresh, pressed into the damp earth beside the trail. And it wasn't mine. I stopped and looked around. Nothing. Just trees, thick and unmoving. I listened. Still nothing. But that feeling in my gut didn't go away. Someone else had been walking this path not long before me. I shook it off and kept walking, trying to push away the unease creeping up my spine. It was probably just another hiker, maybe a hunter, maybe even an old trail that locals still used. I didn't know, and I didn't want to overthink it. But then I saw another footprint, and another. Whoever it was, they weren't wearing hiking boots. The prints were uneven, rough around the edges, like whoever made them had been dragging their feet. I kept walking, moving quicker now. The sun was starting to dip lower, and I didn't want to get caught out here after dark. When I finally reached my camp, I felt a wave of relief. My tent was still there. My gear was untouched. Everything looked just as I had left it. I tried to shake the feeling off. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. I was alone out here. That's what I had wanted after all. That night, I sat by the fire, eating another simple meal. The feeling of unease still lingered, but I kept telling myself there was no reason for it. Eventually, I crawled into my tent and tried to sleep. That's when I heard it. A sound. A twig snapping. Close. My eyes snapped open. I held my breath, listening. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a dim light over the campsite. The sound had been close, too close. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. Then another sound. Footsteps. Slow. Unsteady. I stayed completely still, heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then the footsteps stopped. Silence. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just listened. Minutes passed. The silence stretched on. Then, finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard the footsteps again. moving away this time, fading into the trees. I lay there for hours, knife in hand, wide awake. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, I convinced myself it must have been an animal. Maybe a deer, maybe a wild boar, but deep down I knew it wasn't. Those were human footsteps, slow, intentional. Someone had been there. I packed up my camp. I didn't want to stay another night. As I hiked back toward my car, I kept looking over my shoulder. Every few minutes I'd stop and listen, but I never saw anything, never heard anything. But when I reached the dirt road, I saw something that made my stomach drop. My car. There were footprints all around it. Someone had been waiting. I didn't think. I just got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. I drove off so fast the tires kicked up dirt and gravel behind me. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town. I checked into a small motel and locked the door behind me. That night, I slept with my knife under my pillow, the weight of it reassuring in my hand. I never went back to that forest. I never camped alone again. And to this day, I still don't know who was out there with me. It had been a long day, and I was exhausted, the kind of tired that sits deep in your bones, making every step feel heavier than the last. I had been working as a woodsman for years, cutting and hauling timber in remote areas, often working alone or with just a few others. This time, though, I was on a solo job, deep in the woods, far from any town or main road. It was supposed to be a simple gig: cut some marked trees, clear a bit of land, and camp out for a few nights before heading back. I had done it plenty of times before, but something about this trip felt different. The sun had been setting when I finally stopped working for the day. I had a small camp set up just off an old logging trail, a little clearing where I had pitched my tent next to my truck. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that made you grateful for a fire, and the smell of pine and damp earth filled the air. The forest was quiet, aside from the occasional rustling of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. I sat by the fire, eating a quick meal, feeling the soreness in my arms and legs from hours of work. The fire crackled, throwing flickering shadows around the campsite, but beyond its glow, the woods were pitch black. There was something about being alone in the wilderness at night that always put me on edge, even after all these years. It wasn't fear exactly, just an awareness of how isolated I really was. If anything happened out here, there was no one to help. As the fire died down, I decided to turn in for the night. My tent was a simple setup, just a small one-person tent with a sleeping bag and a lantern inside. I zipped myself in, listening to the wind moving through the trees, and eventually drifted off to sleep. I woke up suddenly. I didn't know what had pulled me from sleep, but I was fully awake, heart pounding in my chest. The tent was silent. No wind, no rustling branches, just an eerie stillness. I lay there, holding my breath, straining to hear something, anything. Then I heard it, a slow, deliberate crunch of leaves. Not the wind, not an animal scurrying through the underbrush. This was something heavy, something stepping carefully, deliberately. I stayed completely still, listening. Another step, then another. Whatever it was close. I reached for the hunting knife I always kept next to me and slowly unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow, but beyond that, the woods were pure black. I could barely see past the tree line, and then I saw movement, a figure just barely visible standing between the trees. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't an animal, it was a person. They weren't moving, just standing there, watching. I felt my pulse hammering in my ears. My mind raced. There shouldn't be anyone out here. This was private land, miles from any town or hiking trails. Whoever this was, they had no reason to be here. I stayed completely still, watching them, hoping they hadn't seen me move. But then, after what felt like forever, they took a slow step forward. Then another. I gripped the knife tighter, my mind flipping through my options. I had my truck, but my keys were in my bag outside the tent. Running wasn't an option. Not in the dark, not out here. The figure stopped again, just at the edge of my campsite, still too far to make out any details. Then, just as slowly as they had approached, they turned and walked back into the woods. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I just listened, waiting, but I didn't hear any more footsteps, just silence. I waited there for what felt like an eternity, knife in hand, staring into the darkness. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and despite every instinct screaming at me to stay alert, I must have drifted off. I woke up again to the sound of movement. This time, it wasn't just footsteps. It was my truck, the distinct sound of the door handle being tried. I shot up, grabbing my flashlight and knife, unzipping the tent in one quick motion. The beam of light swept across my truck. The driver's side door was slightly open. Someone had gotten inside. My heart pounded as I stepped out of the tent, my grip tight on the knife. The fire had completely died out now, leaving the camp in near total darkness, just the faintest hint of dawn creeping over the horizon. Then the door slowly shut, and I saw them, a man, standing on the other side of my truck, just barely visible in the dim light. He didn't move, just stood there, staring at me. I took a step forward, raising the flashlight higher. My hands were shaking, but I tried to steady myself. I didn't say anything. I wasn't about to let this guy know I was scared. Then, without a word, he turned and walked into the woods. Not running, not sneaking, just walking. I stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Then I moved fast. I grabbed my bag, yanked open the truck door, and jumped inside, locking the doors behind me. My hands fumbled as I grabbed the keys from the bag, shoving them into the ignition. The engine roared to life. The headlights flooded the forest ahead, casting long shadows through the trees. But the man was gone. I didn't waste any time. I threw the truck into reverse, backing up onto the old logging road, and gunned it out of there. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, until the sun was fully up and the woods were behind me. Only then did I let myself breathe. I never went back to that job. I told my boss the land wasn't safe, that there were trespassers. He sent someone else to finish it, but I never found out who that man was, or what he wanted, and I don't think I ever want to. I had been camping alone for years, never having any trouble. It was something I looked forward to every summer, a break from the noise of daily life. I was careful, I planned well, and I stuck to spots I knew were safe. But last year, I made a mistake. I chose the wrong place. The area was deep in the mountains, miles away from any town. I picked it because it was isolated, quiet, the kind of place where you wouldn't hear a single car or see another person for days. That was the appeal until it wasn't. I arrived in the late afternoon, parking my truck at the end of a dirt trail and hiking about a mile in. The air was damp from an earlier rain, and everything smelled like wet pine. I found a clearing near a slow-moving river and set up camp, pitching my tent close to the tree line for wind protection. As I gathered firewood, I noticed how quiet it was. Too quiet. Normally, even in remote areas, you'd hear birds, maybe the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. But here, nothing. Just the wind through the trees. I shook it off, telling myself I was overthinking. I had been in silent stretches of forest before. It was rare, but not impossible. That night, I sat by the fire, eating a quick meal, enjoying the solitude. The sky was clear, the stars stretching over me like a blanket. The silence started feeling peaceful instead of eerie. Then something changed. A twig snapped somewhere in the distance. I looked up from the fire, scanning the dark tree line. Could have been a deer, maybe even a raccoon, but my gut said otherwise. The snap had been deliberate, like something heavy stepping down. I stayed still, listening. Nothing. After a while, I convinced myself it was just an animal and went into my tent. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I woke up sometime past midnight. I wasn't sure what had pulled me from sleep at first. The air was thick with dampness, my breath visible in the dim light of the tent. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. They weren't near the tent, but they weren't far either. Somewhere just beyond the trees, I could hear the crunch of leaves, the way the steps paused every few seconds like whoever or whatever it was listening. I held my breath. I wasn't new to this. I had encountered people in the woods before, but never at night, never this deep in the wilderness. I reached for the hunting knife I always kept in my pack and stayed silent, waiting. The steps moved closer. I could hear the way the dirt shifted under the weight, the way the person, because now I was sure it was a person, stepped carefully, trying not to be noticed. I stayed completely still, every muscle tense. Then, just as suddenly as they started, the footsteps stopped. The silence stretched. I waited, barely breathing. Nothing. I wanted to check outside, but I knew better. If someone was out there, they were waiting for me to make a move. I forced myself to stay still, gripping my knife, my ears straining for any sound. Then, after what felt like hours, I finally drifted into an uneasy sleep. I woke up stiff, my mind clouded from barely sleeping. The first thing I did was step outside, scanning the area. Everything looked normal, but when I circled the camp, my stomach dropped. There were footprints, not boot prints, not hiking shoes, bare feet. They led from the tree line to just a few feet away from my tent before turning back. I stared at them, my skin crawling. They weren't mine. I had worn boots the whole time and they were too big, too wide. Someone had been watching me, standing just outside my tent while I slept. I felt exposed, vulnerable. I wanted to pack up and leave, but a stubborn part of me told me I was overreacting. Maybe some backwoods guy had wandered too close by accident. Maybe he had left when he saw my tent. I told myself I'd stay one more night, but I'd be extra cautious. I should have left. I kept the fire going as long as I could, the glow pushing back the darkness. I stayed alert, watching the trees, listening. Nothing happened for hours. Then, just past midnight, the footsteps came back. This time, they were closer. I could hear the slow crunch of dirt, the way they circled the camp, deliberate and unhurried. I gripped my knife, every nerve in my body screaming to run. Then, a sound that made my blood turn to ice. A low exhale. Close. Too close. Right outside the tent. I felt the shift in the air, the presence of something just beyond the thin fabric. I tightened my grip on my knife, my pulse hammering. Then the tent fabric moved. A slow, dragging motion like a hand brushing against it. I snapped. I lunged forward, slashing through the fabric with my knife, bursting out of the tent. Nothing. The fire had burned down to embers, barely illuminating the area. The woods were empty, but the footprints were there, fresh, leading right up to my tent, then vanishing back into the trees. I grabbed my gear, not even bothering to pack properly. I just stuffed what I could into my pack and bolted. The mile back to my truck felt endless. Every crack of a branch made me spin around, knife in hand, expecting something to lunge from the darkness. Nothing did. I reached my truck, throwing my gear into the back, my hands shaking. I drove, not stopping, not looking back. It was only when I got home that I noticed the final, chilling detail. My tent had been slashed, not from my knife, but from the outside. Long, deep cuts in the fabric. Whoever had been out there, they weren't just watching. They were trying to get in. I don't camp alone anymore. I had been planning the trip for weeks. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple weekend alone in the Peak District, away from the noise of the city. I had done solo camping before, mostly in places that weren't too far off the beaten path. But this time I wanted something quieter, somewhere I wouldn't be disturbed by anyone. I had found a spot on an old map, a clearing near a dense patch of forest, about a 2-hour hike from the nearest road. I set off on a Friday morning, carrying everything I needed in my rucksack. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that makes you pull your jacket tighter but not unbearable. The hike was mostly uneventful, just miles of open land, rolling hills, and the occasional bird song. I followed an old dirt trail that looked like it hadn't been used in years, probably made by farmers or hikers long before I ever found it on the map. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun had started to dip behind the hills. I could hear a stream nearby, which was perfect since I had planned to collect water from there. The first night went by without much trouble. I set up my tent, got a small fire going, and had a simple meal before turning in for the night. The wind picked up a little, making the trees sway and creak, but that was normal. I had camped enough times to know the sounds of the outdoors, so nothing felt out of place. I fell asleep quickly, the fresh air doing its job. It was the second day when things started to feel off. I woke up early, just as the sky was starting to turn gray. The morning was cold, and the fire had long died out. I crawled out of my tent and stretched, my breath visible in the morning air. The place was as quiet as it had been the night before. Too quiet, I noticed. No birds, no rustling in the trees, just the faint sound of the stream in the distance. I decided to take a short walk, just to explore the area a bit. I followed the stream for a while, taking in the landscape. That's when I saw it. Something in the mud, near the water. At first, I thought it was just a pattern in the dirt, but as I stepped closer, I realized they were footprints. Bare footprints. They were deep in the mud, as if someone had been standing there for a while. The strange thing was they were fresh. The edges hadn't been softened by rain or wind. Someone had been standing there recently. I felt a wave of unease wash over me, but I shook it off. Could have been from a hiker, maybe someone who liked walking barefoot. But something about them didn't sit right with me. They led toward the trees, disappearing into the undergrowth. I told myself I was being paranoid and headed back to my tent. The feeling stayed with me, though, sitting heavy in my stomach. I kept glancing over my shoulder as I walked, feeling as if I was being watched. But when I reached my campsite, everything was exactly as I had left it. My tent was undisturbed, my rucksack untouched. I tried to push the weird feeling aside and got on with my day. The afternoon passed without much incident. I gathered some firewood, made another small meal, and sat by the fire as the light faded from the sky. But as night settled in, the unease returned. The silence felt unnatural, like something had driven the wildlife away. I barely slept that night. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear something. Twigs snapping, the soft crunch of leaves underfoot. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a fox or a badger moving through the trees. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Whatever was out there was heavier. It moved with purpose. At some point in the night, I heard something closer. It was so faint, I almost convinced myself I imagined it. A slow, deliberate dragging sound, like someone pulling their foot through the grass. It was close, just outside my tent. I held my breath, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the sound stopped. I lay there, unmoving, for what felt like hours. When the first light of dawn crept through the tent fabric, I finally forced myself to move. I slowly unzipped the tent and peered outside. The first thing I saw was the ground outside my tent. The dirt was disturbed, marked with deep impressions. Footprints, not just one set, but several circling my tent. A cold dread filled my stomach. Someone had been outside my tent while I was sleeping, watching. I packed up as quickly as I could. I didn't bother with breakfast or taking my time. I just wanted to get out of there. I stuffed my gear into my rucksack, kicked dirt over the fire, and started moving. The hike back felt much longer than it had coming in. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following me. The trees felt closer, the silence more oppressive. Then, about halfway back to the road, I saw something ahead of me on the trail. It was small at first, barely noticeable. A scrap of cloth caught in the undergrowth. I stepped closer, my hands clenching into fists. It was a piece of dark fabric, torn and dirty, and beside it, on the ground, was a footprint. Fresh. Someone had been here, recently, watching me. I didn't stop to think. I started moving faster, almost breaking into a run. My rucksack bounced against my back, my breath coming in short gasps. I didn't care about the noise anymore. I just wanted to be out of the trees, away from whoever had been following me. When I finally saw my car parked by the roadside, relief flooded through me. I threw my rucksack into the boot and locked the doors as soon as I was inside. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. As I pulled away, I looked in the rearview mirror one last time, back toward the trees. There was nothing there, but I knew someone had been out there with me, watching, waiting, and they had let me go. Winter came early that year, colder than it had been in decades. The snow was thick on the ground by late November, and the rivers had frozen over before December had even begun. I had been planning this trip for months, though, and I wasn't about to let the cold stop me. I packed up my truck with everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, propane stove, plenty of food, and extra clothes. My plan was simple: drive up into the remote mountains, set up camp near the river, and spend a week in complete solitude. The spot I had chosen was miles away from any town, just a clearing in the woods near an old logging road. I had camped there before, but never this deep into winter. The drive up was slow. The roads were icy, and snow had piled up along the shoulders. By the time I reached the turnoff to the logging road, the sun was already starting to sink behind the trees. I followed the winding path, the tires crunching over frozen ground, my truck struggling in places where the snow was deeper. I had chains on the tires, though, and I knew the route well. It was nearly dark by the time I reached the clearing. I killed the engine and stepped out into the freezing air. The silence was immediate. No wind, no birds, just the dull hum of the cooling engine and the faint creak of trees settling under the weight of the snow. I could see my breath in the air, thick and heavy. It was colder than I expected, probably below zero already. I got to work setting up camp. The ground was frozen solid, making it difficult to drive in the stakes for my tent. I had to use the back of my axe to hammer them in. I laid down a thick tarp, then unrolled my sleeping bag on top of an insulated mat. The firewood I had brought was dry, and after some effort, I got a fire going. The flames crackled and hissed as the heat melted the snow around the pit. I sat by the fire, eating a hot meal and listening to the stillness of the forest. The darkness felt heavier out here, the sky clear and full of stars. The only sound was the occasional pop from the fire and the distant groan of ice shifting on the river. It wasn't until I was getting ready to turn in for the night that I noticed something odd. There were footprints in the snow. At first, I thought they were mine. I had been walking back and forth, setting up camp. But these prints were different. They came from the trees, stopping about 20 feet from my campsite. The snow was too packed down to make out much detail, but they were definitely human and fresh. I stood there for a long moment, staring at them. They weren't mine. They weren't leading anywhere. Just a short line of steps that ended in the middle of the clearing. Like someone had walked out of the woods, stood there, and then disappeared. I looked around, shining my flashlight into the trees. Nothing. No movement, no sound. Just the cold, empty forest. I told myself it was probably just an old set of prints. Maybe a hunter had passed through earlier in the day. Maybe I had just overlooked them when I first arrived. I forced myself to ignore it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I climbed into my sleeping bag, fully dressed in layers to keep warm. The wind had started to pick up, rattling the trees. The fire outside was dying down, but I didn't bother getting up to feed it. I just lay there listening. Then I heard it, a crunch in the snow, faint, distant. I held my breath, straining to hear over the wind. Another crunch, closer this time. I reached for my flashlight, slowly unzipping my sleeping bag. My heart was pounding in my chest. I flicked the light on and aimed it toward the trees. Nothing. The snow was untouched. The footprints were still where they had been before, no new ones leading away. The trees swayed in the wind, shadows shifting across the ground. I waited, listening. Silence. I told myself I was imagining things. I had been alone for barely half a day, and already my mind was playing tricks on me. That had to be it. Still, I kept the flashlight close, my knife within reach. Sleep didn't come easy that night. The next morning, everything looked the same. The snow was untouched except for my own tracks. The footprints were still there in the clearing, unchanged. No new ones had appeared overnight. I tried to shake the unease. I focused on my routine, boiling water, making breakfast, checking my supplies. The day passed slowly. I spent the afternoon gathering firewood, keeping an eye on the tree line. I told myself I was being paranoid. But then, as the sun started to set, I noticed something else. The footprints were gone. The same ones I had seen the night before. The ones I had checked that morning. They weren't there anymore. The snow hadn't melted, it was too cold for that. And there had been no fresh snowfall. But the prints had vanished, like they had never been there at all. Cold knot formed in my stomach. Someone had been here. Someone had wiped them away. I looked at the ground around my camp, scanning for any sign of movement. Nothing. No new prints. No sign of anything disturbing the snow. I stood there, my breath heavy in the freezing air. Then, in the distance, deep in the woods, I heard something. Not the wind, not an animal. A single, deliberate sound. A branch snapping. Slow. Intentional. I turned toward the noise, staring into the darkening trees. My pulse hammered in my ears. I couldn't see anything, but I knew something was there, watching. I moved quickly, stoking the fire higher, keeping my knife at my side. I thought about packing up and leaving, but it was already getting dark. Driving down that icy road at night wasn't safe. So I waited. The fire burned through the night. I barely slept, my ears straining for any sound. I didn't hear anything else, but I felt it. Something was out there. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed up camp as quickly as I could, constantly checking the tree line. I felt exposed, vulnerable. As I loaded the last of my gear into the truck, I took one last look around. The clearing was empty. The snow was untouched. I got in and started the engine. As I turned onto the old logging road, I caught a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror. A figure, standing just at the edge of the trees, too far to see clearly, but close enough that I knew it had been watching me. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I just kept driving, my hands white-knuckled on the wheel. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the main road. I never went back to that spot, and I never camped alone in the winter again. That trip should have been like any other, just another cold week in the woods. But something was out there that winter, watching, waiting, and I don't think it wanted me to leave. I don't go camping alone anymore. I used to think of the woods as a place where I could be by myself, where I could breathe fresh air and let my mind go quiet for a while. I don't feel that way now. I still go out there, but never alone and never unarmed. It was 2013 when this happened. I was 29 years old, working a construction job that had me traveling a lot, but I had a long weekend off and decided to use it for a solo camping trip. I grew up in Montana, and the woods had always been my escape. I was comfortable out there. I had been camping since I was a kid. Hunting, fishing, hiking. I knew what I was doing. I had a good rifle, plenty of supplies, and a reliable old truck that had never let me down before. I picked a place deep in the mountains, far from any roads, far from any other campers. I wanted peace and quiet, and I found it. A long dirt road took me deep into the valley, and from there, I hiked about 4 miles in until I found a good spot by a creek. The trees were thick, the ground was dry, and there were no signs of recent bear activity. It seemed perfect. I set up camp like I always did, pitched my tent, got my firewood ready, and made sure my rifle was within reach. The first day was uneventful. I spent most of it fishing, catching just enough to cook over the fire. The air was cool, the sound of the creek was relaxing, and as the sun went down, I felt at home in the quiet. The first sign that something was wrong came just after sunset. I had finished eating and was sitting by the fire when I heard something move in the trees behind me. It wasn't a small sound. It wasn't the rustling of a rabbit or the snap of a single twig. It was a slow, deliberate movement, like something big was shifting its weight. I turned fast, my rifle in my hands, but there was nothing, just the dark trees and the quiet. Could have been an elk, maybe a deer, but I had been in the woods long enough to know that animals don't move like that unless they're spooked. And there was no reason for anything to be spooked out there. I stayed up for a while longer, listening, waiting. Nothing else happened that night, but I didn't sleep well. The second day was quiet, almost too quiet. The birds, the squirrels, even the sound of the wind seemed muted. I didn't think much of it at first. Some days are just like that, but I had an uneasy feeling I couldn't shake. I spent the day hiking further up into the hills, carrying my rifle just in case. I didn't see any signs of large animals, no fresh tracks, no scat, nothing. It was like the whole valley had emptied out overnight. That evening, as I was cooking, I heard it again. The same slow, heavy movement in the trees. This time it was closer. I stood up, rifle in hand, scanning the treeline. The fire cast long shadows, flickering against the trunks. I couldn't see anything. No eyes reflecting in the dark, no obvious shapes. But I knew something was there. Then I heard something worse. It was my voice, not an echo, not a trick of the wind. It was my voice, calling my own name from somewhere in the trees. It wasn't a perfect copy. It was close, but not quite right. The tone was off, the inflection unnatural. It sounded like someone who had heard me talk, but didn't fully understand how speech worked. I felt my stomach drop. My first instinct was to run, but I didn't. I backed toward my tent, keeping my rifle up, scanning every inch of the darkness. My fire was low, but I didn't want to turn my back to gather more wood. The sound came again, this time further away, deeper in the woods. My name stretched out, wrong. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire going, sitting with my rifle across my lap, waiting for the sun to rise. Every so often, I thought I heard something moving just beyond the firelight, sometimes close, sometimes far. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was getting out. I packed my gear quickly, keeping my rifle in hand the entire time. As I started my hike back toward my truck, I felt watched. The feeling didn't leave me, not for a second. About halfway back, I found tracks. They weren't human, but they weren't animal either. The shape was wrong. The spacing was too wide, like whatever had made them had an unnatural stride. I didn't stop to study them. I just kept moving. I was relieved when I saw my truck. I loaded my gear fast, threw my rifle in the passenger seat, and started the engine. It roared to life, and for the first time in 2 days, I felt safe. I was just about to put it in drive when I saw something in the rearview mirror. Something stepped out of the trees. It was tall, too tall. Its limbs were long, its body thin, and its skin was the same color as the trees. Its face, I don't know how to describe it. It wasn't a person, but it wasn't an animal. It was something in between, something that shouldn't exist. Tilted its head, watching me. Then it smiled. Not a natural smile. A forced, unnatural stretch of its mouth, like it had seen a human smile before and was trying to imitate it. I slammed the truck into gear and tore out of there, kicking up gravel as I sped down the dirt road. My hands were shaking, my heart pounding. I didn't stop driving until I hit the highway, and even then, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see that thing standing on the side of the road, watching me go. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Not at first. What was I supposed to say? That I had seen something that shouldn't exist? That I had heard my own voice calling to me from the trees? I didn't go back to that valley. I didn't camp alone anymore. Years have passed, and I still think about that night. I still wonder what would have happened if I had stayed another night, if I had followed the sound of my own voice, if I had hesitated just a little longer before leaving. I don't wonder enough to go back and find out. It started as a trip to clear my head. I was 34, and life had been piling up on me in ways I hadn't expected. Work was draining, the city felt suffocating, and I needed space. Real space, not a weekend drive or a walk through the park. I wanted to be away from everything. I picked a spot far from home, somewhere deep in a national forest I had never been to before. I drove for hours, passing through small towns and empty highways until the roads turned to gravel. By the time I reached the edge of the forest, the sun was already dipping behind the trees. The place was perfect, silent, endless, and untouched. I parked my truck off an unmarked path, packed my bag, and walked in. No trails, no signs, just trees stretching in every direction. I had a GPS, a map, and my compass. I wasn't reckless. I knew how to navigate. I'd camped alone plenty of times before. The first few hours were peaceful. The only sounds were my boots crunching against the damp ground and the occasional rustling of something moving through the undergrowth. Probably deer, maybe a raccoon. I wasn't worried. By the time I set up camp, the forest was nearly dark. I pitched my tent, built a small fire, and ate a quick meal. The night settled in around me, thick and heavy. Stars pushed through the gaps in the canopy. It was exactly what I needed. I slept lightly, waking up a few times to the distant sound of animals. Owls, the occasional snap of a branch, the usual. But then, sometime deep into the night, something changed. It was the stillness that got me first. That unnatural, pressing silence that makes your skin prickle. No wind, no rustling, nothing. Just complete, suffocating quiet. I sat up in my sleeping bag, heart pounding. Then a sound. Not an animal. Not the wind. Something deliberate. Slow, heavy steps moving through the woods, just beyond the fire's dying glow. I reached for my flashlight, gripping it tight, my breath held. The footsteps stopped. I strained to listen, trying to place them, but there was nothing. Just that awful, unnatural silence. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a deer walking through. Maybe the sound carried wrong in the dark. I lay back down, forcing myself to breathe evenly. Minutes passed. Then, another sound. Closer. A slow, dragging step, followed by another. I sat up again, scanning the darkness with my flashlight. The trees swallowed the beam, giving me nothing but shifting shadows. My fire had burned down to embers, casting weak, flickering light. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. Something was out there. I stayed awake for hours, listening, heart hammering. But the footsteps never came back. Eventually, exhaustion won. I lay back down, gripping my knife in one hand, and fell into uneasy sleep. Morning felt safer. The sunlight made the night seem like a bad dream, but I knew it wasn't. Something had been out there, watching. I packed up camp and hiked deeper into the woods, trying to shake the unease. I told myself I had imagined it, that it was just the unfamiliarity of the place playing tricks on me. Still, I kept my knife on my belt, my hand brushing against it every few minutes. By midday, I reached a small clearing near a stream. It seemed like a good spot, so I set up my tent again, built a fire, and tried to push the night out of my mind. I spent the afternoon hiking, following the stream as it wound through the trees. The forest was dense, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and pine. It should have been peaceful, but something was wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something standing there, but there was nothing, just trees stretching endlessly in every direction. I told myself I was being paranoid, but when I got back to camp, I noticed something. My tent was open. I knew I had zipped it. My bag had been moved. Nothing was missing, but everything felt wrong, like someone had been there searching through my things. I scanned the trees, every muscle in my body tense. Nothing. I checked the ground, looking for tracks, but the earth was too hard, the leaves too thick. If someone had been here, they hadn't left a trace. I thought about leaving, packing up and heading back to my truck, but I had hiked deep miles into the woods. It would take hours to get back, and the sun was already dropping. I told myself I was overreacting, that I had left the tent open by accident, that my bag had shifted somehow. I forced myself to stay. That night, I kept the fire burning high. I didn't sleep. I sat by the fire, gripping my knife, listening. The forest was too quiet. Hours passed. Then a sound. Not footsteps this time. Breathing. Slow, heavy breathing. just beyond the edge of the firelight. I held my flashlight, shining it toward the trees. Nothing, but the breathing didn't stop. I could feel it just beyond my vision. Someone or something standing there watching. I didn't move, didn't blink. Then it stepped closer. I saw it, a figure just at the edge of the light, barely visible but there, standing, waiting. My stomach dropped. I gripped my knife tighter, my mind screaming at me to run. But I didn't. I stared at the figure and it stared back. Minutes passed. Then, slowly, it stepped back into the dark. The breathing faded. The forest swallowed it whole. I didn't sleep, didn't move. As soon as the sun rose, I packed my things and left. I hiked fast, pushing through branches, barely stopping to catch my breath. I didn't care about the trails, didn't care about my map. I just needed to get out. Took hours, but eventually, I saw my truck. Relief crashed over me. I threw my bag in, started the engine, and tore down the dirt road, not looking back. I don't know who or what was out there. I don't want to know. I haven't been camping alone since. It had been almost a year since my husband passed. People said time would make it easier, but I wasn't sure that was true. It had just made everything feel quieter, like the world had moved on while I was stuck. I needed to get away, to clear my head, so I packed up my truck and drove into the woods. Camping was something we used to do together, back when life was normal. He was always the one who made sure everything was safe, checking the site, locking up the truck, keeping a gun close. Now I was alone. I had to be the one to keep myself safe. I picked a spot deep in the forest, miles away from the nearest town. It wasn't an official campsite, just a clearing I found on an old hunting map. I liked the idea of being completely alone. No people, no noise, just the trees and the sound of the river in the distance. The first day was uneventful. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and made a simple meal. As the sun set, I sat by the fire, listening to the crackling of the flames. The night was cool, but I had plenty of layers. But as the hours passed, I started to feel it, that uneasy sense that something wasn't right. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid. I was alone, and the silence made my mind play tricks on me. But then I noticed something. The usual sounds of the forest, crickets, rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl had stopped. It was dead silent. That wasn't normal. I tried to brush it off, but my body was tense. I could feel the way my heartbeat had picked up, how my breathing had changed. My husband always said to trust those instincts. When something feels off, it usually is. I stood up slowly and grabbed my flashlight, shining it into the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. No movement, no glowing eyes staring back at me. Just trees and empty space. I told myself I was being silly. I was just on edge because I wasn't used to being alone out here. But I kept the fire going longer than I normally would, just in case. That night, I barely slept. Every little sound made my eyes snap open. The wind shifting the trees, the distant howl of a coyote. I was hyper-aware of everything. My husband's gun was in the tent with me, and I kept it close. The next morning, I forced myself to shake it off. I made breakfast, packed some snacks, and went for a short hike. I needed to distract myself. The sun was shining, the trees were beautiful, and for a little while, I felt okay. But then I found something that sent a chill through me. Footprints. Not mine, not a hunter's. Bare feet. The prints were deep, meaning whoever made them was heavy. And they weren't old. The edges were sharp, like they'd been made recently. I scanned the woods around me, suddenly feeling exposed. The forest was empty, but that didn't mean much. Someone had been out here walking barefoot. That didn't make sense. I followed the prints for a little while, moving slowly, keeping my hand on my gun. They led deeper into the woods, away from my camp. And then, just like that, they stopped. No sign of where the person went. No turnoff, no disturbance in the brush. It was like they had just vanished. That didn't sit right with me. I hurried back to my campsite, suddenly feeling like I needed to leave. I started packing up, shoving everything into my bag as fast as I could. Then I saw it. Something had been in my camp while I was gone. My tent was unzipped, though I was sure I had closed it. My gear was still there, but my sleeping bag had been moved. And on the side of the tent, scratched into the fabric, just deep enough to be noticeable, was a word. Stay. I felt my stomach drop. Someone had been watching me. I grabbed my keys and threw everything into the truck, my hands shaking. I didn't care about packing properly, I just needed to go. As I got in the driver's seat, I caught one last glimpse of the tree line. A figure, tall, standing just at the edge of the woods, far enough that I couldn't make out the face. Watching. I didn't wait. I started the truck and floored it, gravel kicking up behind me as I sped down the dirt road. I didn't look back again. I didn't stop until I was back on a main road, surrounded by streetlights and buildings and the safety of civilization. I never went camping alone again. I never liked camping alone, but I needed the time away. Work had been eating me alive, and the city was too loud, too crowded. I had done a few solo camping trips before, but nothing too deep into the woods, always close to trails, always within reach of civilization. This time, I wanted real isolation. I picked a spot deep in the forests of British Columbia, a place I had found on a map but had never visited before. It was mid-September, just as the weather was cooling down. The leaves had started to turn, and the air carried that crisp, earthy smell of autumn. I drove up a dirt road for miles, far from any established campgrounds. My truck was packed with everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, food, a good hunting knife, a rifle, and enough firewood to last a couple of nights. The spot I chose was about 3 miles from where I parked, deep into the trees. I had a lightweight backpack with just the essentials and left the rest in the truck. I figured if anything went wrong, I could hike back easily. That decision was a mistake. The first night was uneventful. I set up my tent in a small clearing near a shallow stream. The air was still, the silence only broken by the occasional rustling of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. I made a small fire, cooked some canned food, and sat back, enjoying the peace. The forest around me felt calm, almost too quiet, but I chalked it up to my nerves. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange sound. It was distant, somewhere in the woods, but I couldn't place it. Not an animal, not the wind. It was almost like breathing, deep, slow breathing. I told myself it was just my imagination and forced myself back to sleep. The next morning, I hiked a bit, took some photos, and spent the day exploring. I came across some old, overgrown trails, maybe from hunters or loggers years ago. I found an animal carcass too. Looked like a deer, but something had torn it apart. Not eaten, just ripped to shreds. That put me on edge. That night, I made my fire a little bigger. I wanted the light, the warmth. The woods felt different now. Not calm, not peaceful. I felt watched. I tried to sleep early, but my body wouldn't let me. Every little sound made my heart race. And then, around midnight, I heard it again. The breathing, closer this time. I lay still, barely even breathing myself. I reached for my knife, my fingers cold and stiff. The sound was steady, slow, like someone standing just outside my tent. Then it stopped. I waited, heart pounding in my chest. No footsteps, no rustling, just silence. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I must have drifted off. The next morning, I found something outside my tent. A footprint, not an animal's. A human footprint, barefoot. I wasn't alone. Panic hit me hard. I packed up my gear fast, barely stopping to eat. I wanted to get back to my truck before anything else happened. The 3-mile hike back felt longer, every snap of a twig making me whip my head around. Halfway there, I saw something that stopped me cold. Another footprint, fresh, on the trail. Someone was ahead of me. I gripped my knife tighter, scanning the trees. Nothing. I moved faster, almost running. The closer I got to the truck, the worse the feeling got, like something was driving me forward, chasing me without a sound. When I reached my truck, my hands were shaking so bad I struggled to get the keys out. I threw my backpack in, locked the doors, and started the engine. Then I saw it. In the trees, maybe 50 feet away, a figure, tall, thin, naked, just standing there watching me. I didn't think. I hit the gas so hard my tires spun in the dirt. I didn't stop driving for hours. When I finally pulled over at a gas station, I got out trying to breathe, trying to calm down. My hands were still trembling. That's when I saw it. A single, dirty handprint on the back of my truck. I never went camping alone again. I had always liked the idea of camping in the countryside, away from the noise of the city, away from the constant notifications on my phone, away from everything that made life feel like it was moving too fast. The idea of slowing down, being alone with nature, cooking over an open fire, it felt right. So when I finally got a break from work, I packed my gear and headed out. The place I had picked wasn't a popular campsite. It was a stretch of countryside I had driven past a few times, a vast open space with rolling hills, thick patches of trees, and barely any signs of people. It was perfect, quiet, isolated, just me and the land. I reached the spot in the early evening. The sun was beginning to dip behind the hills, casting long shadows. The dirt road that led there was rough, barely used, with patches of grass growing between the tire tracks. I had to take it slow in my truck, the suspension creaking as I moved over the uneven ground. I parked near a small clearing where the grass was shorter and the ground looked firm. I got out, stretched my legs, and took a deep breath. The air was different here, clean, fresh, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and dry grass. The only sounds were the distant rustling of trees and the occasional chirping of birds. No cars, no people, just quiet. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing, close enough to the trees that I had some shade, but far enough that I wouldn't have to worry about roots or uneven ground. I took my time securing the stakes, making sure everything was tight. I had learned from past trips that a loosely pitched tent could be a nightmare if the wind picked up. After setting up, I gathered some firewood. The forest had plenty of dry branches, and I took only what I needed. Took a few tries, but eventually I got a fire going. The flames flickered in the dimming light, crackling softly. I cooked a simple meal, just some canned beans and bread, nothing fancy, but it filled me up. As night settled in, the temperature dropped. The warmth of the fire was comforting, and I sat there for a while, just listening to the sounds of the night. Crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional rustle in the bushes. Then, at some point, I noticed something. The rustling had stopped. It wasn't immediate, but after a while, I realized that the normal night sounds had faded. The crickets were quieter, the wind barely moved the trees, and even the distant hooting of the owl had gone silent. It felt unnatural. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a predator had passed through, something small like a fox or a coyote, making the smaller animals go quiet. That happens sometimes. But even knowing that, I couldn't shake the unease creeping into my gut. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the tree line. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and more trees. I forced myself to relax. It was just the quiet of the countryside, nothing to be afraid of. I turned in for the night, zipping myself into my sleeping bag. The fire had died down, leaving only glowing embers. My tent was small but warm, and I tried to push away the unease. I closed my eyes, listening to the faint sounds of nature as I drifted off. At some point, I woke up. It was pitch black. I couldn't tell what had woken me, but something felt wrong. I lay still, listening. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Soft, slow, just outside the tent. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer or something, but these steps were deliberate. Not the quick, nervous movements of a wild animal, but slow, careful. I held my breath, listening. The steps circled the tent. A shiver ran down my spine. My mind raced through possibilities. Who would be out here? I hadn't seen a single person for miles. My truck was parked nearby, but no one should have been able to find me unless they had been watching. I reached for the knife I always kept in my sleeping bag. My fingers wrapped around the handle, gripping it tight. The footsteps stopped. Then, a soft shuffle. Someone was right outside. I waited, my heart pounding. Minutes passed. Nothing. Then, slowly, the sounds faded. I lay there for what felt like hours, straining to hear anything else. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and at some point, I fell asleep. Morning came too quickly. The first thing I did was check around the tent. The ground was dry, but near the entrance, I saw them. Footprints, not boot prints, bare feet. I stared at them, my stomach twisting. They led from the trees, circled my tent, then went back the way they came. I looked around, scanning the area. Nothing else seemed disturbed. My truck was fine, my gear untouched. But someone had been here, watching. I debated packing up right then and there, but something in me didn't want to leave just yet. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe I didn't want to feel like I had been scared away. I told myself it was just some weirdo passing through. But that day, I felt different. The peacefulness I had enjoyed before was gone. I kept checking over my shoulder, scanning the trees. Every little sound made me jump. I stayed another night. I shouldn't have. That night, the footsteps came back. This time, I was ready. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. I just listened. They were closer this time. Whoever it was, they stopped right outside the tent. For what felt like an eternity, nothing happened. Then I heard it. A slow, deliberate drag of a finger along the fabric of my tent. I gripped my knife so hard my knuckles ached. The sound moved around the tent. A slow, scratching touch. Then silence. I stayed awake all night. I didn't sleep, not even for a second. As soon as the first light of dawn broke, I unzipped my tent, stepping out with my knife in hand. Nothing, but the footprints were there. Fresh ones, circling my tent again. I didn't waste time. I packed everything, shoving my gear into the truck. I didn't even eat. I just got in and drove. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. At the tree line, standing just beyond the edge of the clearing, was a figure. Tall, still, watching. I didn't slow down. I didn't stop. I just drove. I never went back to that place. And I never camped alone again. I spent my whole life camping. It was something my dad passed down to me, and I carried it with me into adulthood. I've never been afraid of the outdoors. I know the sounds, the dangers, the smells, the way the air changes before a storm, how the temperature drops before dawn. I know when a sound is just a squirrel hopping through leaves and when something heavier is moving through the trees. I thought I understood the wilderness, but I had no idea how wrong I was. This happened in the summer of 2019, somewhere deep in the mountains of Colorado. I had planned a week-long solo camping trip. Nothing extreme, just some time away from the noise of everyday life. I picked a remote spot, a place I had camped before, a good distance from any official trails. I like to be alone, far away from crowded campsites, away from people. I had my truck loaded up with everything I needed. I parked on the side of an old forest road and hiked in about 5 miles. The spot I chose was near a small creek, with thick pine trees all around. It was quiet, untouched, no signs of other campers, no trash, no remnants of a fire pit, just wild as it should be. The first day was perfect. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, cooked a simple meal, and sat by the fire as the sun dipped behind the tree line. The night was peaceful, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the last person on earth. The second day, I explored the area. I hiked up a small ridge, took in the view, and followed the creek for a while. At one point, I noticed something strange. A small clearing with a circle of rocks, like a makeshift fire pit, but no signs of ash or burnt wood. It was just a ring of stones, old and weathered. It didn't seem important at the time, just something odd. That night, I felt something change. I was sitting by my fire, listening to the crackle of burning wood, when I heard a sound in the distance. A branch snapping. Not unusual, deer, raccoons, even the wind can break branches. But this was different. It was deliberate, slow. I stopped moving, listening, straining to hear beyond the normal sounds of the woods. Then silence. Nothing. I let it go, assuming it was my mind playing tricks on me. But later, as I lay in my tent, I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow, steady. Not an animal. An animal moves differently. Quicker, uncertain, pausing, sniffing, adjusting. This was something else. I held my breath, waiting, heart pounding. And then, just like before, silence. The next morning, I searched the area. I didn't see any tracks, nothing out of place. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me after 2 days alone in the woods. I went about my day as usual, hiking, fishing in the creek, enjoying the quiet. But that feeling of unease never really left me. That night, everything escalated. I built a larger fire than usual, trying to push back the darkness. I sat close to it, watching the flames. That's when I heard it again. Closer this time. A branch snapped, then another. Something was moving in the trees, just beyond the firelight. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I strained my eyes, trying to see past the flickering firelight, but there was only darkness. And then I saw it, the figure, just barely visible, standing between the trees. I couldn't make out any details, just a tall, dark shape, standing perfectly still. Watching me, I didn't breathe, I didn't move. I just sat there, gripping the knife at my side, waiting. And then, as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. I stayed up the rest of the night, fire roaring, eyes locked on the trees. I told myself it had to be another camper, some hiker who stumbled across my sight. Maybe they were just checking to see who I was before moving on. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The next morning, I packed my things. I wasn't going to spend another night out here, not with whatever was out there watching me. As I hiked back toward my truck, I felt it again, that creeping sensation of being watched. I moved fast, barely stopping for water, pushing through the underbrush, desperate to get out. And then, as I crested a small hill, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Footprints, not mine. They were fresh, deep in the soft dirt, leading from the trees directly toward my camp. Whoever had been watching me had gotten closer than I thought. I didn't stop after that. I ran the last half-mile to my truck, threw my gear in the back, and got the hell out of there. I've camped plenty of times since then, but never alone. Never that deep in the woods. Because I know now that sometimes, out there in the wilderness, you're not as alone as you think. I had been planning this camping trip for weeks. I needed a break. Work had been grinding me down, and I hadn't felt like myself for a long time. My idea was simple: drive out to a remote forest, set up camp, and spend a few nights away from everything. No phone, no emails, no city noise. Just me, the trees, and the quiet. I picked a spot in a national forest I had read about online. It was deep in the woods, far from any established campgrounds. The kind of place where you wouldn't see another person for miles. That's exactly what I wanted. A true escape. I packed my gear carefully: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a knife, a small axe, a first aid kit. I even brought a firearm just in case. I didn't expect trouble, but when you're alone in the wild, it's better to be safe. The drive took longer than I expected. The roads turned from pavement to gravel, then to dirt. After a few more miles, even that faded into little more than a rough path cutting through the dense trees. The deeper I went, the less it felt like a place anyone had been in a long time. That was fine by me. Eventually, I found a decent clearing beside a small stream. The spot was perfect: flat ground, fresh water, plenty of space for a fire. I set up my tent, got a fire going, and made a simple meal as the sun started to drop. The air smelled fresh, the wind was light, and aside from the sounds of the forest, there was nothing but silence. As the night took over, I leaned back against a log and stared into the flames. This was exactly what I had wanted. The stress of work, of the city, of everything gone. The fire crackled, the cold crept in, and after a while, I decided to call it a night. I crawled into my tent, zipped myself into my sleeping bag, and listened to the night sounds. Crickets, the occasional rustle of leaves, distant owls. It was peaceful. I drifted off quickly. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. The fire had died down to embers, but something had stirred me from sleep. It wasn't a dream. Something had changed in the woods. I held my breath, listening. Silence. That wasn't normal. The forest was never completely quiet. Even at night, there were always small sounds, bugs, wind, the occasional snap of a branch. But now there was nothing. I stayed still, straining to hear. Then, just barely, I caught it. Footsteps. They weren't loud, but they were there. Slow, deliberate, moving through the brush. Not an animal, too steady, too careful. I felt my pulse quicken. My first thought was a hiker, but I knew that wasn't right. No one else should be out here. No one had any reason to be. The steps stopped. I lay in my tent, barely breathing. The silence stretched on. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks. Maybe a deer, maybe the wind shifting branches. I turned over, trying to settle my nerves. Then I heard it again. Closer. A slow, deliberate step. Then another. Someone, or something, was right outside my tent. I didn't move. I barely even blinked. My heart pounded so hard I was afraid whoever was out there could hear it. I reached slowly for my knife, gripping it tight. Then, nothing. The steps stopped. The woods stayed silent. I waited, but whoever was out there didn't move again. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted back into an uneasy sleep. Morning came, and I forced myself to step out of my tent. The forest looked normal, peaceful. I checked around my campsite, searching for tracks. I found them. Boot prints. Not mine. They were fresh, pressed into the dirt. Someone had been walking around my tent, watching. I scanned the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing. I told myself it was just a hunter, maybe a lost hiker. But deep down, I knew better. I should have packed up, left right then. But I didn't. I convinced myself I was overreacting. I wasn't going to let some weird footprints scare me away. The second night was worse. I kept my fire burning brighter, staying up later than the night before. I wanted to be awake if anything happened. And it did. Around midnight, the silence came again. That heavy, unnatural quiet. Then the footsteps. This time, they didn't stop outside my tent. They moved, circling, slow, steady. Whoever it was, they were walking around my campsite. I gripped my knife again, my other hand resting on my firearm. I wanted to call out to let them know I was armed, but I didn't. If they knew I was awake, what would they do? Then, just like before, the steps stopped. The silence stretched on. I stayed awake for hours, gripping my weapon, waiting. Nothing. Eventually, exhaustion won again. To first light, I stepped outside. The air was cold, the fire reduced to ashes. I checked the ground. More tracks. They had been even closer this time. I packed up fast. I wasn't staying another night. As I loaded my gear, I felt it, that sensation of being watched. I didn't look around. I didn't want to see anything. I just finished packing, got in my vehicle and left. The drive back felt longer. Every turn in the road, every shadow in the trees felt wrong. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something. I never did. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I do know one thing. I'll never camp alone again. I didn't mean to end up in the graveyard that night. It wasn't part of my plan. But when you're alone in the middle of nowhere with the sun going down and no good place to set up camp, you take what you can get. It was early autumn 2015. The days were still warm, but the nights were cold enough to remind me that winter wasn't far off. I had taken a week off from work to get away from everything. No phone calls, no emails, no people. Just me and the outdoors. I wasn't an experienced camper, but I had done enough solo trips to know how to handle myself. I had been hiking through the backcountry of northern Maine, following an old logging road that hadn't seen use in decades. It was slow going, the road overgrown with weeds and trees pushing through cracks in the pavement. My pack was heavy, but I had enough supplies to last me several days. Around late afternoon, I realized I had made a mistake. I had underestimated how much ground I could cover before nightfall. The plan had been to reach a small clearing near a stream where I could set up my tent. But the trail had been rougher than expected, and I had taken a wrong turn at some point. By the time I checked my map, I was nowhere near my intended spot. I didn't want to set up camp in the middle of the trail, but I also didn't want to keep hiking in the dark. That's when I saw it. A break in the trees to my left, an old rusted gate barely visible through the brush. I pushed through the overgrowth and stepped onto a small dirt path. The gate had long since fallen apart, leaving only a few rusted metal posts sticking out of the ground. Beyond that, the land sloped downward into an open space. It took me a moment to realize what I was looking at. The ground was uneven, covered in patches of tall grass and fallen leaves. Scattered among the weeds were old headstones, some leaning, some broken, most covered in moss. It was a graveyard, a small one, probably forgotten, maybe 100 years old or more. There was no church nearby, no sign that anyone had been here in a long time. It must have been a family plot, back when people buried their dead on their own land. I hesitated. Camping in a graveyard wasn't exactly ideal, but the ground was flat, and I was exhausted. The trees around the perimeter would block the wind, and there was no sign of animal activity. It was better than trying to set up my tent on the side of the road. I found a spot near the edge of the graveyard, away from the headstones, and started unpacking my gear. The air was getting colder, and the sun was already dipping below the trees. I set up my tent quickly, unrolling my sleeping bag inside before gathering some wood for a small fire. By the time I got the fire going, the sky had gone dark. I sat beside the flames, eating a simple meal of dried meat and granola. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind moved through the trees. It wasn't until I had finished eating that I started to feel uneasy. At first, I told myself it was just the setting. A graveyard, alone in the dark. Anyone would feel a little unsettled. But the longer I sat there, the more I felt like something wasn't right. It was too quiet. The wind had died down, and the forest had gone still. No insects, no owls, no distant sounds of animals moving through the underbrush. Just silence. Then I noticed something else. The air smelled wrong. Not rotten, not like something dead, but stale, heavy, like the inside of an old, abandoned building that hadn't been opened in years. I tried to shake the feeling. I was just letting my imagination get the better of me. I had camped alone plenty of times before. I had spent nights in the deep woods, far from civilization. This was no different, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned my head slowly, scanning the graveyard, my eyes adjusting to the darkness beyond the fire's glow. The headstones stood like crooked teeth, casting long shadows across the ground. There was nothing there, nothing I could see. I told myself to stop being paranoid. I banked the fire, crawled into my tent, and zipped myself inside my sleeping bag. I lay there, listening, waiting for the sounds of the night to return. But the silence stretched on. I don't know how long I lay there before I finally drifted off. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside my tent. A slow, deliberate movement. I held my breath, my heart hammering in my chest. Then came another sound. A soft, scraping noise, like something dragging across stone. I lay completely still. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint orange light against the walls of my tent. I could see the shapes of the trees, the outlines of the headstones. Then something moved, a shadow, long and thin, passing in front of the tent. I felt my stomach tighten. My mind raced through possibilities. An animal? A deer? No, the movement had been too slow, too deliberate. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight. The sound came again, a soft scrape, closer this time. Couldn't just lie there. If something was out there, I needed to know what I was dealing with. I took a slow, deep breath, and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire was nearly out, but the embers still glowed. Beyond that, the graveyard was a patchwork of darkness and faint light. The headstones stood still and silent. There was nothing there. I exhaled slowly, trying to calm my nerves. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it had been the wind. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. A figure, standing between two headstones. I didn't get a good look, just a glimpse before it stepped back into the shadows. My blood turned to ice. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. Was it a person? Had someone been watching me this whole time? I waited, watching the darkness, but I saw nothing else. Minutes passed. My muscles ached from staying so tense. I had two choices: stay put and hope it was nothing, or get out of there. I chose the second option. Moving as quietly as I could, I packed up my gear. I didn't bother taking down the tent. I'd come back for it later. I just needed to get away. I slung my pack over my shoulder and grabbed my flashlight, keeping it off. I didn't want to draw attention. As I stepped away from the tent, I kept my eyes on the graveyard, scanning for movement. Nothing. I moved quickly, heading toward the old gate. Then, just as I reached the path, I heard it. A whisper, a breath of sound, so faint I almost thought I imagined it. I didn't look back. I walked faster, my pulse pounding in my ears. The second I reached the road, I broke into a run. I didn't stop until I was miles away. When I finally made it back to my car the next morning, I sat behind the wheel, trying to make sense of what happened. Maybe it had been my imagination. Maybe it had been a trick of the light. Maybe it had been some drifter passing through. I don't know. All I know is that I left my tent and gear behind, and I never went back for them. And I never camped alone again. I was alone in the woods of southern France, deep in a part of the country where small towns sat miles apart, and the roads between them twisted through endless forests and rolling hills. It was early autumn, late enough in the season that most tourists had packed up and gone home, leaving the landscape empty except for the occasional hiker or hunter. The days were still warm, but at night, the air turned crisp, and the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves clung to everything. I had planned this trip for months, picking a remote area where I could spend a few days camping, hiking, and enjoying the quiet. The campsite I chose wasn't an official one, just a clearing I had found after studying old maps and satellite images. It was miles away from the nearest road, hidden behind a dense stretch of trees, and bordered by a small stream that trickled down from the mountains. It was perfect. The first day passed peacefully. I arrived in the late afternoon, set up my small one-person tent, and gathered enough firewood to last the night. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I ate a simple meal, listening to the distant hoots of owls and the rustling of leaves in the wind. There was something comforting about being alone in nature, far away from the distractions of the world. But as night fell, the feeling changed. The silence became heavier, pressing down on me like a weight. The trees around my campsite swayed gently in the breeze, their branches casting shifting shadows against the ground. I tried to shake off the unease, convincing myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew something felt off. First, it was little things. A faint snapping sound in the distance, like a twig breaking underfoot. A whisper of movement just beyond the firelight. I told myself it was an animal, a fox maybe, or a deer wandering through the forest. But the noises continued, steady and deliberate, never straying too far from my campsite. I sat by the fire, staring into the darkness, my ears straining for any sound. Then, I heard its slow, measured footsteps, moving just beyond the reach of the flames. They stopped when I turned my head, as if whoever or whatever it was didn't want to be seen. I wasn't carrying a firearm, only a small hunting knife strapped to my belt. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me feel a little less helpless. My mind raced through the possibilities. Maybe it was another camper, lost in the woods. Maybe a local hunter passing through. But why wouldn't they announce themselves? I stood up, scanning the trees, Hello! I wanted to call out, but the word caught in my throat. Something about the situation made me hesitate. Instead, I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the trees, sweeping the beam back and forth. Nothing, just trees, thick and unmoving, stretching into the blackness of the forest. The footsteps had stopped, but I could still feel something watching me. I forced myself to sit back down, keeping my knife close and the fire burning strong. Hours passed, the night dragging on painfully slow. The noises didn't return, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. At some point, exhaustion won out. My eyelids grew heavy, and despite my fear, I dozed off. My body slumped against a log by the fire. I don't know how long I slept, but I woke to the feeling of cold air pressing against my skin. The fire had burned low, flickering weakly, and the air smelled damp, like fresh rain. And then I noticed something was wrong. The clearing felt different. The air was heavier, the silence more suffocating. I sat up slowly, my heart pounding, my instincts screaming at me to stay still. That's when I saw it. Just outside the ring of dying firelight, a shape stood motionless between the trees. Tall, human-shaped. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. I froze, gripping my knife so tight my knuckles ached. My breath was shallow, controlled. If I ran, I knew it would chase me. If I spoke, it would know I was afraid. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the figure. It never moved. The fire crackled, sending faint shadows dancing across its shape, but it remained still. Then, slowly, the figure stepped back. Not all at once, but gradually, melting into the darkness. It didn't make a sound as it retreated, disappearing into the blackness between the trees. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I kept my knife in my hand, my eyes fixed on the darkness, waiting for the figure to return. It never did. As soon as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I packed my things and left. I didn't take the trail back to my car. I cut straight through the forest, moving fast, desperate to put distance between myself and that place. By the time I reached my car, my hands were shaking. I locked the doors the moment I got inside, my heart still hammering in my chest. I never found out who or what had been watching me that night, but I never went camping alone again. It had been 3 months since my cousin, Eric, passed away. It didn't feel real. We grew up together, spent summers at our grandparents' farm, went camping every year in different places, and had always planned on keeping the tradition going no matter what. Then suddenly he was gone, just like that. Car accident. Someone ran a red light, hit him from the side, and he didn't make it. I kept telling myself that I should be getting used to it, but I wasn't. Felt like something was missing every day. That was why I decided to go on the camping trip we had planned before he died. I thought it might help. It had been set for the first weekend of October, right when the air would start getting crisp and the leaves would be turning. We had picked a remote spot in the woods a few hours from town, away from the usual campgrounds. Somewhere peaceful. No trails leading to it, no other campers around, just quiet. I told myself it was the right thing to do. Maybe spending time out there, doing what we always did, would help me feel close to him again. But from the moment I started packing my truck, something felt off. I ignored it. I told myself it was just the weight of everything, that it was just grief making me feel strange. The drive was long. I had the radio off the whole way, just listening to the sound of the tires on the road. The last stretch was a dirt path barely wide enough for my truck, covered in fallen leaves. It had been raining earlier in the week, so the ground was damp, making the air smell like wet earth and rotting leaves. I found the spot easily. It was exactly as I remembered from when we scouted it months ago. Just a clearing in the middle of the trees, near a narrow stream. No signs of anyone else having been there. That was what we liked about it. I got out of the truck and stretched, looking around. The sun was low, casting long shadows through the trees. I should have gotten there earlier. Setting up camp in the dark was never fun, so I got to work quickly. The tent went up first, then the fire pit. I gathered some wood, set up my chair, and made sure everything was in place. As I worked, I kept thinking about Eric, about how we had planned to be here together. I told myself that if I could just get through the night, maybe I'd feel better. The first couple of hours were fine. I made a fire, cooked some food, and sat there listening to the woods. The sounds were familiar, distant rustling, the occasional hoot of an owl, the bubbling of the stream. But then, as the night deepened, something started to feel wrong. First, it was just a feeling, like I wasn't alone, like something was just out of sight, watching. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just on edge because it was my first time camping alone. But then I started hearing things. Soft crunching in the leaves. Slow, careful, not an animal. I turned my head toward the sound, but it stopped. I tried to shake it off, but it happened again. A little closer this time. Leaves shifting, branches moving. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the trees. Nothing, just darkness. I told myself it was my mind playing tricks on me, but the feeling didn't go away. It sat in my chest, heavy and uncomfortable. I forced myself to focus on the fire, poking at the logs, trying to keep my hands busy. But then I heard something else, a faint snapping sound, like a twig breaking underfoot. Closer this time. I turned my flashlight toward the sound again, and for a split second, I thought I saw something, a shape, person, just past the tree line. I froze. My heart started pounding. I aimed the flashlight back, but there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. I told myself it was the dark playing tricks on me, that it had just been my own mind putting shapes where there weren't any. I stayed up longer than I meant to, staring into the darkness, waiting to hear something else. But nothing came. Eventually, I convinced myself it was all in my head and went into my tent. I zipped it shut and lay down, forcing my breathing to slow. I needed sleep. I'd feel better in the morning. But then I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, careful, moving around my camp. I stopped breathing, my ears straining. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't my imagination. Something or someone was out there. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight. My heart was hammering. The footsteps moved closer. Then they stopped, right outside my tent. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The air inside the tent felt heavy, suffocating. I waited. Nothing. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Then, finally, the footsteps moved away. I lay there, gripping my knife, waiting for them to come back. But they didn't. I don't know how long I stayed awake, but eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off. When I woke up, the sun was rising, casting pale light through the trees. For a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined it all, that it had just been a bad dream. But then I stepped outside, and I saw them, footprints, clear as day, circling my tent, leading to the trees. Someone had been there, watching me. I packed up fast. I didn't eat, didn't take my time. I just grabbed my things, threw them in the truck, and got out of there. The whole drive home, I kept thinking about Eric. He should have been there. Maybe if he had been, it wouldn't have happened. Maybe if he had been, I wouldn't have been alone out there. Maybe that was the worst part, that he was gone, and that whoever had been out there watching me wasn't. It was late October when I decided to go camping deep in the woods of Montana. I needed time away from everything, work, people, and the endless noise of the city. I wanted silence, the kind you can only find when you're miles away from civilization, where the only sounds come from the trees swaying in the wind and the distant calls of animals. I had planned for a 3-day trip. I packed everything carefully: tent, sleeping bag, enough food and water, my hunting knife and my rifle. I had been camping alone for years, so I wasn't worried about anything. I knew the basics. Don't leave food out, don't wander too far from camp at night, and always be aware of your surroundings. I drove out early in the morning, the back of my truck loaded with gear. The drive took nearly 5 hours, first on paved roads, then gravel, then dirt trails that had barely been used in years. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun was already past its peak. I grabbed my pack, locked my truck, and started hiking. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. The trail wasn't marked, but I had a map and a GPS, and I had been in this area before. I hiked for about 4 miles before finding a spot that seemed perfect. A small clearing surrounded by dense trees, with a creek nearby for water. The sun was starting to set as I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and got everything ready for the night. By the time the fire was going, the temperature had dropped. I cooked a simple meal, ate quickly, and sat by the fire, enjoying the silence. The woods were alive with the usual sounds: crickets chirping, branches creaking, the occasional rustle of leaves as some small animal moved through the underbrush. It was peaceful. But then, as the fire crackled and the night grew colder, I started to notice something strange. The usual sounds of the forest were off. It wasn't completely silent, but it felt like something had changed. The crickets were still chirping, but their rhythm seemed unnatural, almost forced. The rustling in the bushes wasn't random. It was steady, deliberate, as if something was moving in a pattern. I tried to shake it off. I had been in the woods enough to know that sometimes your mind plays tricks on you. The wind shifts, animals move, and you start imagining things. But even as I convinced myself that there was nothing to worry about, I felt uneasy. I decided to call it a night. I put out the fire, crawled into my tent, and zipped it up. The inside was warm, my sleeping bag thick enough to keep the cold out. I lay there, listening to the night, trying to ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. Then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it. Footsteps. Not an animal. Not the sound of branches falling or the wind pushing through the trees. These were footsteps, slow, deliberate, and close. I held my breath, listening. My rifle was within arm's reach, but I didn't want to grab it yet. If it was a bear or some other animal, making sudden movements could make things worse. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. I could hear breathing, deep, heavy breathing. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away. Slowly, one step at a time, whatever it was walked back into the woods. I didn't sleep that night. I lay there, knife in hand, listening to every sound. By the time the sun came up, I was exhausted, but I forced myself to get up. I stepped out of the tent, rifle in hand, and looked around. Nothing seemed disturbed. There were no tracks, no signs that anything had been there. But I knew what I had heard. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I convinced myself to stay. Maybe it had been my imagination. Maybe I had been half asleep and misheard something. I wasn't going to let fear ruin my trip. The second night was worse. As the sun set, the uneasiness returned. The forest felt wrong again, like something was watching me. I built a bigger fire, hoping it would keep animals or whatever else away. But as I sat there, I started to hear something. It was faint at first, carried by the wind, but as I listened, my stomach dropped. It was my name, whispered, stretched out. I stood up, rifle in hand, scanning the trees. The fire crackled, casting shadows across the clearing. The whisper came again, closer this time. Then, from the darkness, I saw something move. At first, it looked like a deer, a tall, thin figure with long limbs. But as it stepped closer, the firelight hit its face. It wasn't a deer. Its face was almost human, but wrong. The features were stretched, distorted, like something was trying to wear a human face but didn't know how. Its eyes were too big, its mouth too wide. It stood there, watching me. Then, in a voice that was almost mine, it spoke. It repeated my name. I didn't think. I raised my rifle and fired. The shot echoed through the trees. The thing didn't react. It just stood there, staring. Then, slowly, it stepped back into the darkness and disappeared. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, rifle in hand, waiting for the sun. When morning finally came, I packed my gear as fast as I could and started hiking back to my truck. The entire way, I felt like I was being followed. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my pack in the back, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Standing at the tree line, just barely visible, was the thing, watching me. I never went back, and I never camp alone anymore. I was a cop for 12 years before I quit the job for good. I've been in bad situations before, things I still wake up thinking about. But nothing, not one thing I ever dealt with in the force, prepared me for what happened that night in the woods. It happened in 2019. I was 39, divorced, and had just left the police force 3 months earlier. I didn't have a plan. I was just tired. Tired of the job, tired of the things I saw, and tired of the way it changed me. I needed time to think, time to be alone. So, I did what I always did when I needed to clear my head. I went camping. I had a place I liked going to, a few hours north of where I lived. It was a remote patch of forest near a state park, but far enough off the beaten path that no one else usually camped there. No marked trails, no roads leading in, just a long, winding drive down an unpaved fire road until you hit a dead end. From there, you had to hike in another mile or so. That was what I liked about it. The quiet, the solitude. I packed light, tent, sleeping bag, enough food for a few nights. I brought my old .357 too, a habit from years on the job. Not because I expected trouble, but because I always liked knowing I had it just in case. I got there in the afternoon, parked my truck at the dead end, and started hiking. The air was cool, damp from recent rain. I reached my usual spot by a small clearing next to a narrow creek and started setting up camp. I didn't plan on doing much, just sitting by the fire, maybe hiking around a bit the next day. I had no idea that before the night was over, I'd be fighting for my life. I got my tent set up, gathered some firewood, and started a small fire. As the sun went down, I sat there, drinking coffee, watching the flames. Then, just as it was getting dark, I heard something. It was faint. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it again. A snapping branch, footsteps, someone walking maybe 100 yards away in the trees. I didn't move, just listened. Another step, then nothing. Silence. I told myself it was an animal, a deer maybe, but something about it didn't sit right with me. Then I smelled it. A terrible, sharp, metallic stench. Blood. I stood up slowly, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. The wind shifted, and it hit me even stronger. Somewhere out there, in the dark, something was dead. I grabbed my flashlight, took my pistol out of my pack, and started walking toward the smell. The trees were thick, and the light barely cut through the darkness. I walked slowly, scanning ahead, every nerve on edge. Then I saw it. A man lying face down in the dirt. My first instinct was to check for a pulse, even though I already knew he was dead. His body was stiff, cold. He had been out here for at least a day. He was wearing jeans, a jacket, boots. Looked like another camper, but something was off. His clothes were torn, dirty, like he'd been running through the woods. His hands were scraped up, palms bloodied, and his face was frozen in an expression of pure terror. I checked his pockets, found a wallet. His name was Daniel Green, 34. Address was 3 hours away. No keys, no phone. I stood up, scanning the darkness around me. Something bad had happened here. I'd seen dead bodies before, but this was different. This wasn't some accident, some lost hiker who fell and hit his head. This man had been running from something, and whatever it was still out here. I backed away slowly, keeping my flashlight low. I needed to get back to camp, get to my truck, and call this in. Then I heard it, the sound of movement. Close. I turned the light off. For a long moment, there was nothing, just the sound of my own breathing. Then another sound, this time closer. Something was in the trees watching me. I couldn't see anything. The woods were too thick, but I could feel it. The way you can feel when someone's standing right behind you. I didn't run. Running makes noise. Instead, I started moving backward, slowly, one step at a time. I kept my breathing steady, listening. Another sound, branches shifting. Closer now. Then, Just for a split second, I saw something. A shape, a figure low to the ground, barely visible in the dark. It was crawling. I raised my gun. Whatever was out there, it wasn't human. I didn't wait. I turned and ran. Not a full sprint, I needed to stay quiet, but fast enough to put distance between me and whatever was back there. I reached my camp, grabbed my bag, and shoved my pistol into my waistband. The fire was still burning, flickering shadows against the trees. I turned in the direction of my truck. Then I stopped. The footsteps were back, and they weren't trying to be quiet anymore. I could hear them, crunching through the leaves, moving fast. I bolted. The trail was barely visible in the dark. I ran blind, branches whipping against my arms and face. My heart was hammering in my chest. I reached the fire road and saw my truck. Then I heard it again, right behind me. I didn't turn around. I fumbled with my keys, threw the door open, and jumped inside. Something crashed through the brush behind me. I started the engine. In my mirror, I saw movement, a shape just at the edge of the trees. I hit the gas. I didn't stop driving, not until I was back on paved roads miles away. I pulled over, hands shaking, and called it in. Sheriff's deputies found Daniel Green's body the next morning. No sign of struggle, no footprints but mine, no explanation. They ruled it an accident. Exposure, maybe a fall. I knew better. I never went back to that place again, and I never camped alone after that.